the bisexual crossdresser who murdered Rasputin and then couldn't shut up about it before battling Hollywood. Hello, welcome to Royalty, where I spill the tea on all your favorite dead royals, and today we will be discussing Prince Felix Yusupov. Now, if you know Prince Felix Yusupov, and you might, you may know him for murdering Rasputin, as I've just said, because quite frankly there's a lot of films and books about it. He mentions it in multiple books of his own, but he's such a fascinating figure of the early 20th century that honestly I wanted to talk about him and all his adventures, and it's so fascinating that I'm actually going to make two videos about this. So in this, our first video, I will be discussing his family background, his early life, his relationship with his family members, and his marriage. Now, let's get started. Before we do, there is a quick disclaimer that, technically speaking, Prince Felix Yusupov is not a royal. The title of prince, as we call it in English, is the Russian title of knyaz, which is loosely translated as prince. However, he is not a member of a dynastic ruling royal family. As we know, the royal family of Russia, the Romanovs, have tsars and tsarinas, grand dukes and grand duchesses. So the title of knyaz or prince is more akin to a duke in the United Kingdom, for instance. However, it is the highest title of Russian nobility, so don't make the mistake of thinking that he came from an insignificant family. He did marry into the Romanovs. He eventually married Princess Irina Romanov, the niece of Tsar Nicholas II, but we will get into that. The Yusupov family may have been the richest one in Russia. We are not quite certain if they were the richest in the world or one of the richest in the world, because their wealth is just so great that it's difficult to know exactly how much they owned. We know that Felix was heir to a fortune that included 57 palaces. That's not 57 houses, mansions or villas, it's 57 palaces with over 30 additional estates, and he owned villages, factories, and they made a lot of money from that. But one of the other ways that the Yusupovs were able to retain their great wealth is that they didn't have many children. If we look at the family tree, in every generation only one member had offspring of its own. And this is because of what's come to be known as... Prince Felix mentions this very briefly in his books, but it's mentioned in other sources as well, that apparently a witch cursed the Yusupovs several decades before Felix was born, and the curse included that in every generation, every child would die before the age of 26, except one, who would then go on to produce offspring. This is a very specific curse, I must say. I mean, if you wanted to curse a family, why not curse a nobleman to be barren so that his line would die out completely? But it is the truth. If we look at the family tree, in every generation, everyone dies before the age of 26, except one who then continues to have offspring. And that prevents the fortune from being scattered. I mean, if you have, let's say, 7 sons who each have to inherit part of your fortune, fortune gets scattered pretty quickly. I'm looking at you, Tsar Alexandra II. Who were Felix Yusupov's parents? His mother, Zinaida Yusupova, was probably the most eligible bachelorette in Imperial Russia back in her day, because at 18 she was heiress to the fortune that would be between 500 million and 1 billion US dollars today. She was also a great beauty of St. Petersburg society. She had a pick of royal suitors. In fact, Prince Alexander of Battenberg was actually suggested as a match, and if you know anything about Victorian royalty, you know that the Battenbergs made excellent connections. However, she fell for Count Felix Sumarokov-Elston, who was a military man. He came from a less well-established family than Zinaida herself, but she put her foot down, she married him, and many people thought it was a shame, but at least she was happy at the start. With Count Felix Sumarokov-Elston, she had 2 sons. She actually made a deal with the Tsar. The Tsar gave them special permission for Count Felix to use his wife's last name and to also grant that last name to their children, so that the Yusupov family wouldn't die out. And that is why Zinaida and Felix's son, Felix Jr., is Prince Felix Yusupov and not just Count Sumarokov-Elston. So he actually inherited his wealth and his title from his mother. Now, Felix was born in 1887, about 4 years after his brother Nicholas, and apparently he was so ugly as a baby that his brother thought it was a monkey and he begged his mother to throw him out the window. But his mother doted on little Felix and she spoiled him a lot. Now, if we are to believe Felix's memoirs, and we must take them with a bucket of salt, Felix was quite a little enfant terrible in his early days. There are a lot of funny stories. Apparently once his parents hosted the Emir of Bukhara and Felix pranked him with fireworks, which made everyone present think that there was an assassination attempt going on. And his parents were quite angry with him, but apparently the Emir thought it was funny and forgave him. They were also once in Paris visiting for the Grand Exhibition, and Felix sprayed the Parisian police with a hose, and they were not amused. There are lots of other funny stories. Once his father made a final attempt at giving him a strict military upbringing, and he had the servants draw him a cold bath. And Felix was so upset by this that he ran outside naked up a tree where he refused to come down as servants shouted up at him. I think that it was the last attempt his father made at a military education. He also made a grand tour around Italy with his tutor, but he was able to evade his tutor and he ended up getting into a brothel in Naples. However, because of his young age, he didn't know that it was a brothel. He just thought, oh, the ladies here really aren't wearing much, are they? Alright, so we know a lot about Felix's spoiled childhood. The spoiled little rich boy who owned everything and traveled around his numerous estates, and they were numerous. They usually stayed at the Moika Palace in St. Petersburg. There were also Koreis in the Crimea. Every fashionable Russian had a palace in the Crimea at this point. There was Arkhangelskoye, his sort of summer estate, and there was the Yusupov Palace in Moscow, in addition to many, many other palaces. In fact, as an adult, once he had lost everything, Felix said that he hadn't even visited all of his grounds, estates and houses that he owned, and he wasn't actually sure how many he had inherited. What does Felix Yusupov have to do with the Romanovs at this point? Well, about 8 kilometers or 5 miles from the Arkhangelskoye estate was Ilinskoye, and that was owned by Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich Romanov, the uncle of Nicholas II, and his wife Ella of Hesse, who was coincidentally also the Tsarina's sister. Felix remembered Sergei as this intimidating, tall, strange man who was always wearing corsets, and Ella as a great beauty, of course. She is described as Queen Victoria's most beautiful granddaughter, and she was quite famous for it. Now, these two didn't have children of their own, possibly because of Sergei's homosexuality, but they did adopt his niece and nephew, who had lost their mother and whose father had basically gone off and had an affair with a divorced common woman and had then been banished to Paris, where he had 3 more children. So Marisha and Dmitri were his playmates, his neighbors. They were a little younger than him, and whenever his older brother Nicholas wasn't around, he would play around with them. And in due time, Ella of Hesse became a sort of second mother to him. Now, as for Dmitri, his close friend, there may have been an attraction between Felix and Dmitri. We're not quite sure. I think it's fair to say that Felix at least had a crush on him. And that brings me to the very, very strange story of how Felix Yusupov lost his virginity. So Prince Felix Yusupov alleges that at the tender age of 13, he had gone to France with his mother, and there he had caught the eye of a handsome Argentinian soldier who'd invited him to his house, where he had a threesome with Felix and his girlfriend, and that's how he lost his virginity, allegedly. Again, this is from his memoir, Bucket of Salt. It is very interesting that after this, Felix told his brother about this. Apparently, they were on such good terms at this point that he openly came out to him and told him about this. He described it in his memoirs, saying, "I was so amazed by what I had learned that in my youthful ignorance I failed to discriminate against the sexes. In my imagination, I began to picture men and women I knew in the most ridiculous positions." There's been a lot of claims that Felix Yusupov was a closeted bisexual, or that he was never quite open about his attraction. But I mean, he published this book in the 50s where he openly spoke about this Argentinian soldier that he had sex with, and other men are mentioned, though in a less explicit fashion. Now, this threesome, if it ever happened, wasn't his first time crossing the boundary of gender conformity, let's say. Early in his life, he had stolen his mother's clothes and jewels and had actually gone out to dinner with a friend without paying, which was quite a scandal, and his father was very upset by that. But that wasn't the last of his adventures in drag. At this time, his older brother Nicholas had a girlfriend, Polya. Once, when they were in Paris, Nicholas and Polya dressed Felix up in Polya's clothes and took him to the theatre, where he actually caught the eye of Edward VII, also known as Dirty Bertie. He was the Prince of Wales at the time, and apparently he was very attracted to young Felix, not realizing that it was a young boy in drag. This wasn't the last time that this happened. As I've mentioned, Felix's mother, Zinaida, was a noted beauty and had many admirers. One of these, Mr. Wittgenstein, allegedly once stormed into the Yusupov palace, into the dining room, on horseback, declaring his love for Zinaida. And he came across Felix years later, who was cross-dressing at the time. And of course, he looked a lot like his mother, especially wearing her clothes. And Prince Wittgenstein tried to get with Felix, and he was not interested. Felix's cross-dressing adventures continued to Russia. Nicholas actually took him to the Aquarium, which was a very famous nightclub in St. Petersburg. It lasted about a week before a member of the audience recognized the jewels that Felix was wearing as the jewels belonging to Zinaida Yusupova, and that's how he was found out. So he had a terrible row with his father, who sent him to a military academy, which wasn't fun, and Felix was also a little angry with Nicholas, who hadn't quite stuck up for him and who had gotten him into this mess to begin with. Although this is just Felix speaking, we don't have Nicholas's account of the entire affair, but it is possible that he felt responsible to some degree. Nicholas Yusupov himself was a very fascinating character. He was 4 years older than Felix. He was also considered quite handsome, though they didn't look similar at all. And he was an amateur playwright. He moved in the artistic circles of St. Petersburg and Moscow society. He was actually friends with the ballerina Anna Pavlova. He wrote plays, and he liked to act as well. He had a very nice comedic touch in his writing. He wrote under the pseudonym Count Rokov, which I realize now is short for Sumorokov Elston, his father's last name. That's quite clever. And then something awful happened. Nicholas Yusupov fell in love with Marina von Heyden, and she was not deemed an appropriate match. But most importantly, Marina was already engaged, and she married Count Arvid Manteuffel, who were a semi-important Russian noble family. They feature in a lot of scandalous stories around this time. But Nicholas did not give up, especially after consulting with the clairvoyants Chinsky and Madame de Thèbes in Paris. He actually followed Marina and Count Manteuffel to their honeymoon in Paris, where Count Manteuffel found out that his new wife was still having an affair with an old flame. And once they were back in Russia, he challenged Nicholas to a duel. Now, Nicholas once more went to Chinsky, who convinced him that he needed to fight for his love, that he would survive, that he and Marina would live happily ever after. And he didn't. Nicholas was shot by Count Manteuffel and he died just before the age of 26, as the Yusupov curse had foretold. Now, I first read this story in Felix's memoirs and I thought, no way. Nicholas must have died from tuberculosis or jaundice or something. I thought there was no way that His love triangle ended up in a duel, and that's what killed him just in time for the Yusupov curse. However, I found several news articles from the time, like this one, who all confirmed that he did indeed die in a duel with someone who accused him of sleeping with his wife. These were all very real people. Marina actually wrote a book about her time with Nicholas, which included a lot of his letters. They are quite sweet. And we know for a fact that this happened. And that kind of blew my brain because I couldn't have imagined that this story was true. But it is. Felix was obviously very upset by the death of his brother. But he was also now heir to the largest fortune in Russia. Yay. This is what I like to call because he went to Oxford University, he studied forestry and English, and he brought with him a housekeeper, an English valet, a French driver, and a Russian cook, in addition to all kinds of animals. And he brought all of those to 14 King Street, where he lived for several years. Mainly, he hosted a lot of parties. He started an hashish club. He had gone to various opium dens in Europe. He knew what to smoke. He was also friends with Prince Christopher of Greece, who was half Russian and who was around his age. Fun fact, this is an uncle of the late Prince Philip. And Christo, as he called him, and Felix had many adventures together, many parties, a lot of drunk driving, which I wonder why they did that when they both had drivers. One morning, after a party, Christo's Greek attaché was looking for him, and he woke up Felix, like, where is he, where is he? And there were all these people in a drunk stupor around the floor of his apartment. And eventually Christo was found asleep inside a piano. These parties must have been wild. Felix returned to Russia with a lot of education, a lot of adventures, and a lot of animals, which he let loose inside his palace. Which was quite the chaotic situation because all his servants had to go out and catch them, which apparently took hours because he had brought so many of them. Also, quick shout out to Gugus, his Parisian pug. This was his favorite animal, his favorite dog. Felix actually had Gugus for 18 years. He was painted with him, and we also have a behind the scenes photograph of him being painted with Gugus. Both of them were quite famous. I think they were in an exhibition in Venice for a while. So, he returns to Russia. His parents are still quite upset because Nicholas is dead. Felix himself is still grieving him. So, he goes in to check on his Romanov neighbors at Ilinskoy. And a lot has happened in the meantime. So, Grand Duke Sergei may have been homosexual, but he was definitely anti-Semitic and tyrannical in his governing of Moscow. So, he was bombed in 1905. And after gathering the bits and pieces of her husband from the snowy grounds, his wife Ella turned to religion. She became a nun. She started the convent of Mary and Martha. And so she kind of left high society. Though Felix was still in contact with her, she was still a very important person. She was still sisters with the Tsarina. Their adopted daughter / niece, Marisha, had actually been married to a prince of Sweden, which left Dmitri all alone. Or rather, in the care of his cousin, Nicholas II, and the Tsarina, Alex. So Felix went to visit them both a lot, mainly to see Dmitri, who he was friends with. And at this point, you can imagine that his reputation was not too great. Somewhere between the hashish club, the adventures around Europe, his enfant terrible era, and his cross-dressing in St. Petersburg society, he wasn't deemed appropriate company for a Grand Duke. He wrote in his memoirs that the Tsar and Tsarina, who were aware of the scandalous rumors about my mode of living, disapproved of our friendship, referring to Dmitri. They ended by forbidding the Grand Duke to see me, and I myself became the subject of most unpleasant supervision, so we know that the Tsar actually did send spies after Felix to make sure he wasn't up to anything too scandalous. However, despite this, Felix and Dmitri remained friends. There may have been more of an attraction on Felix's side, we'll never know. And this is when Felix decided to make himself a permanent part of the Romanov family. In early 1913, he was at the Crimea with his parents and friends when he came across this beautiful girl on horseback. She was a vision, a goddess almost. And then later at a party, he found out that this mysterious girl who had attracted him was actually none other than Irina Romanov, the niece of Nicholas II. And I'm here to call bullshit! Felix and his parents were such an integral part of St. Petersburg society. There is no way in hell that they wouldn't have known who Irina was. He would have seen her a bunch of times when he grew up. Actually, Irina's father, Sandro, was a big admirer of both Ella and Zinaida Yusupova. He had a crush on them both when he was younger. So they visited each other's houses. They knew each other. However, it is very possible that because of his stay in England, Felix hadn't seen Irina in a while. Their story, even if it didn't have this meet-cute moment on horseback, the story is quite romantic. Their marriage is one of my favorites amongst royal marriages of this time. Felix actually described their relationship in his memoir, and he wrote of how it was actually Irina's tolerance that really attracted him. He wrote, "I concealed nothing in my past life from her. Far from being perturbed by what I told her, she showed great tolerance and comprehension. The deep feeling for her, which was born in my heart, made me realize the unworthiness and triviality of my conduct in the past. There existed between Irina and myself the perfect harmony which is the basis for all happiness." That's quite sweet. He wrote this after decades of marriage, and we actually have a few love letters of Irina left from this time, and she wrote to Felix, "I'm terribly in love with you. I can't live without you. In a word, always known that my main desire is to be always and everywhere near you and never to part." Why Irina was attracted to Felix is up for debate. My personal guess is that Felix was very different from most men Irina knew, both in a good way and a bad way. Of course, as I mentioned, his reputation was basically less than dirt at this point, and Irina was the only niece of the Tsar. She was an important figure in society. She was royal. So you can imagine that there was a lot of opposition to their marriage. There was opposition from the Dowager Empress Maria Fyodorovna, who was Irina's grandmother. There was opposition from Irina's parents, Ksenia and Sandro. Ksenia was Tsar Nicholas II's younger sister. There was opposition from Nicholas and Alex themselves. Alex even told Ksenia, "I would never let one of my daughters marry him." However, Felix talked to the Dowager Empress. He spoke with Irina's parents, with her little brothers, who were also very fiercely protective of their big sister. And he convinced them all that his intentions were sincere, that he loved her, and that he wanted to give her a good life. And you know what? He was wealthier than the Romanovs. He was technically a commoner, but there was no chance of Irina ever inheriting the throne because she was a girl. And so that wasn't as big of a problem. Now, interestingly, Felix mentions that there was also opposition from Dmitri to his marriage, because apparently Dmitri had wanted to marry Irina. Yeah, I'm not too sure about this. I'm not sure if Felix is making that up, if there was actually jealousy, but not towards Irina, but to Felix. We just don't know. I think it is fair to say that for one reason or another, Dmitri was uncomfortable with the thought of Felix marrying his family member. However, in the end, it was up to Irina's parents to either approve or disapprove of the marriage, and they approved of Felix once they had spoken to him, and so they were married in early 1914 in a splendid ceremony that was actually at the palace where Irina's grandmother, the Dowager Empress, lived, so she hosted. Irina wore a veil that allegedly belonged to Marie Antoinette. It was a big, splendid affair. The Tsar's only niece married to Russia's richest noble. What could go wrong? They'd live happily ever after, right? I'm using a sarcastic tone if you can't tell. So Felix and Irina were married in that splendid ceremony. And after their marriage, they went on an elaborate honeymoon, which took many, many months. They went to the Crimea, to Paris, to London, the Italian coast. They went to Nice, they went to Biarritz, they went to Bad Kissinger, where they met up with Felix's parents, and then finally to Berlin, where they ended up in August 1914. August 1914. What happened in August 1914? Oh yes, that's right. Germany declared war on Russia, and these very prominent Russian nobles / royals found themselves stuck in Berlin. They found themselves trapped in Berlin at the worst possible time to be trapped in Berlin as a Russian. Now, how they got out? That is a story for next time, when I'll talk to you all about the First World War, Rasputin, Felix's banishment, his life in Paris, and the unexpected role he fulfilled in his later life after he had defeated Hollywood at their own game. I hope to see you there.